Hi, I want to start by introducing myself and acknowledging the land on which I am presenting today. So I'm Professor Sandy O'Sullivan. I'm a professor in the Centre for Critical Indigenous Studies, and I work across gender and museums, and I spent a lot of time thinking about um, really, ICIP, our cultural property, which we're going to go into some detail about today. I'm here on Darug Noora. Um, Darug people have never ceded the land on which I'm presenting from, and I'm grateful for their continuing grace uh, in allowing us to be on this space, in this space. So I wanted to cover a bit of ground today. I've got quite a lot of images to show, and it's responding to Jacinta Camatri's really remarkable presentation um, from 5 or 6 years ago. Uh, if you haven't watched that yet, if you can just maybe stop this, go and watch that video, and start to think about the readings that are set for the day as well. Um, I'm going to refer back to them because, again, particularly Jacinda's work is just so incredibly powerful. And of course, the readings that you have really frame ideas about who owns and who controls knowledge, where it comes from, and how we challenge the way that that Indigenous people have been pushed into very specific ways of operating and how we've busted out of that. You know, Jacinta's work and peace centrally focuses on this idea of a challenge, and that challenge works um, because we insist on it. And so this is the process of protest, the process of resistance within institutions, but also in defining what those institutions can and should hold. So this is very much also about anti-colonial thinking and redress. And I'll address this issue of the anti-colonial as opposed to decolonial. But of course, it's been also really brilliantly covered in both some of the readings and Jacinta's video. Um, this issue of who owns the knowledge for me always centers in this idea of Yindamara Wanangana, which as a Wiradjuri person, I'm very concerned about this idea of making the world better by being in it, not just continuing the flow of a colonial project that doesn't center Indigenous people. Um, Also, this notion of Indigenous survivance. We heard it with Jacinta's discussion of how you expand the way that Indigenous story and telling and shaping become central in the modern museum space, but also in all of our process of making sense of collections. So I just wanted to give you a sense of where I came from in this, because I'm going to refer back to some of the findings of some much earlier work that I did. It was from 2009 to 2017. And it was a lead up and a very different time in terms of how much the resistances that we pushed were able to affect change. It took time, but it also sometimes took these enormous world-changing moments like Black Lives Matter in 2020, like the very specific work that individual Indigenous people have done, but also, you know, First Nations communities have really centered how much they're willing uh, to continue to engage with these very problematic colonial spaces like museums and keeping places. So I did this work, so it's intentionally blurred because the detail of it's less important than that it was work that was funded by the Australian government. It was very much about trying to work out what works in terms of representation and engagement of First Nations people in national museum spaces. So I visited 470 museums around the world, particularly across three nation groups. I won't go into detail about it. You can read about it if you want to. But very importantly, within this, it was trying to work out where our voices were and where they weren't. So it was really saying what works in terms of that representation, what works when we become a center point of understanding and being there for interpretation. So you would have seen at the end of the video with Jacinta, there's a question mark around, the willingness for institutions to have more than one person, as she framed it, this very dangerous space of only having one person who represents in in these colonial spaces, is that they have a massive amount of cultural load, but also it's extremely dangerous for people. That came through in this work, but what also came through is what we find across a lot of work over the last 20 years done by Indigenous people, First Nations people around the world, is that um, the more that we're present in those spaces, the less dangerous they are. And the more of us there are in these spaces, the less dangerous it becomes. And so uh, it also isn't a salve. That responsibility doesn't have to lie only with First Nations people. And that becomes very clear when we look at ICIP, which we'll come to a bit later. So I visited, as a result of this, spaces like National Museum of the American Indian, these spaces this is a museum that's part of the Smithsonian, which is a 20 plus museums now, museums in the US that are nationally held, faces the Capitol building. It's a really quite a remarkable space, but it continues to be very much structured within the gift of the colonial space. And museums are dangerous. So I came out of it out of um, a site of really thinking about um, not just colonial reparation, but specifically the return of human remains. So I'd worked in that space for a long time in the 90s and then early 2000s to try and challenge these spaces. And I mean try because it wasn't always successful to engage return. Through that time, NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Repatriation Act, that the NMAI, as an example here, was very much a part of, because the NMAI may be a colonial institution, but it's one that has the support and work of a lot of Indigenous people. And uh, their insistences on the repatriation of human remains had this incredible power um, to compel beyond the brief. The brief was across the United States. So not across the whole of Turtle Island, not across other countries, and yet it started to have this impact elsewhere because the conversations were happening and the insistences were there. We were taking back these very dangerous spaces. Museums are dangerous. They're terrible places for Indigenous people, but we also have a right to be uh, in those spaces and engaging with our ancestors' work, but also insisting on our ancestors' remains being returned to our homes. So I mentioned ICIP, Indigenous Cultural and Intellectual Property. Um, this is from the NLA. And I mention this because the NLA, with the best of intentions, has a very, very interesting take on what constitutes Indigenous cultural and intellectual property. Absolutely correct. So documentation of Indigenous people's heritage, all of these in interesting ways have a link back to um, to the museum space. This kind of um, front loaded, but very much accessible to the broader public. Lots of kids go to museums. People are trained up to see museums as this site that is accessible, but it's also this site that is dangerous, and it's this site that largely holds all of these elements. So there's cultural property, there's immovable cultural property, often in some of these spaces. Because of where they're located. There's Indigenous ancestral remains continuing, though there will be in 2030 a separate, at least, holding space for Indigenous remains that will be set up as an important site in Canberra. Languages, yes, and literary, performing, and artistic works, absolutely. Documentation of Indigenous peoples' heritage is central to it, and traditional scientific and ecological knowledge. Central is the notion of cultural property in these spaces. And so these are really held in, all of these are held in that space of a museum's collection. Do they make their way into exhibition is really interesting. Over again, one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about my background is just to suggest this is over a couple of decades, and things change over that time. And again, because of the work that First Nations people have done and other people have done to support First Nations intent across this space, from communities through to people who are working in those spaces. Interestingly, the NLA also frames what generally doesn't contain ICIP. So this is incredibly important to understand because, again, as anti-colonial thinking, part of what we need to do is to interrogate this, not just see it on face value, not just see speeches given by First Nations leaders at public events on topics such as education or community development, which do not discuss or disclose traditional knowledge, is automatically going to be true. So it still needs to be interrogated by us when we're thinking about inclusion, all of us. When we're thinking about including something out of context, which is often what happens with items, we have to think about whether it's actually doing this work. Is it just because something's in the public domain? And some of these exclusions are public domain, though they do have really important mitigations for that. It really matters that this continues to create opportunities to be able to take the elements out of there, put them with something that might disclose cultural practice and so on. So we have to always consider that within that frame. So I mentioned about many things changing over this time. And I mean, one really important point, or over the time that I've been working across museums, which is about roughly 30 years, a little bit longer in terms of some artwork. But this idea of who controls and frames the space changes how stories are told in the space. So in 2021, Laura McBride was appointed to as director of the First Nations collection and First Nations telling at the Australian Museum. The Australian Museum is, the oldest large museum site that has this entrenched coloniality. It is formed in the 1800s at a time where major museums around the world are also formed, including most of the major museums in Britain, even to some extent in terms of public facing the British Museum itself. And so this is a time when there is interest in a kind of framing of the publics. Even in my lifetime, and I'm only 60, even in my lifetime, we have this remarkable shift in spaces like the Australian Museum to going from seeing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as objects within spaces to being seen as agents of the work. Now, that doesn't happen magically, and it doesn't happen because things are happening outside of it. It happens because Laura spends a decade working towards that. Dr. Mariko Smith spends the same amount of time working towards this. They're creating these opportunities within these spaces. It's not at the gift of a museum. And this is a really important point that, again, there are changes that are happening across so-called Australia that transform what's possible in these very important spaces. And they're important, the Australian Museum is important because it is central. It is somewhere that tourists go. It is somewhere that has this cache of knowledge. It's an encyclopedic museum, what we call an encyclopedic museum, but it's largely people will often regard it as a natural history museum, and that presents its own problems, in terms of thinking about First Nations peoples and ensuring that we're not recast as animals, within that space, which has been a critical rendering of places like the Field Museum in Chicago. You can read about that again, where they have some remarkable First Nations exhibitions. And also deep criticism of the fact that it's effectively included within a space that's largely rendered by visitors as a natural history space. So Unsettled was an exhibition that came out, was available online, and by publication, but was in the space. And it challenged a whole lot of ideas around what an exhibition could be. It comes on the back and responds to the Black Lives Matter movement. It happens that they were due to come up with a response exhibition to the anniversary, 250 years anniversary of Cook, and their response was Unsettled, which is really remarkable. I can genuinely say if there had been this kind of work 10 to 15 years ago, it would have been really difficult to have it happen. But also, what makes it possible is the people behind it who are insisting. It's, again, not magic that it can just suddenly happen in 2021. It's this, again, remarkable work that looks at place. So we start to see place become really important in places like the Australian Museum. It starts with where it's located. And we see this in Bunjalaka at the Melbourne Museum too. I think the work that Genevieve Greaves did quite some years ago, more than 10 years ago, 13, 14 years ago now, of setting up a space with the elders group that reacted and responded to the fact that the older rendering in the Melbourne Museum was this very strange overview of Aboriginal Australia that was mostly centered in the Northern Territory. So it was doing a lot of romanticizing of all Aboriginal people live in the Northern Territory. It was doing some of this work that we know is really problematic, but it got shifted to local and to a local meaning, and it was really powerful. So this is the kind of work that they had. They're there centrally in the middle of Sydney, and they're opposite. Dr. Mariko Smith has spoken about this many times. You can find some writing on it as well. Has spoken about the statue of Cook that's opposite, and the implications of this. Of what it means to be here across from there. This does work to challenge. You can see it's got all of these new works in there. It's not thinking of 250 years ago, and it's not thinking of the colonial project. It's centering the idea of survival, survivance, So talked about survivance before, that idea that if we exist now, we exist in the past and will exist in the future. It carries people forward into that. And it's doing it with work that you wouldn't expect if you had stepped foot in an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander exhibition 20 years ago. And so for a lot of people who go into it, it's confronting, great. For others, it's just interesting. And the feedback on it was remarkable, um, and remarkably positive, you might, yeah, just to frame it. And really, it didn't hold back on who became centered in this. So it it pushed out the idea that the most important thing in telling the story of the area and the area around the area is the colonial timeline, um, and instead disrupts that by talking about always was, always will be. One of the things that the museum does, and I just wanted to take you through this, is this notion of, and this is just one example, and obviously with Jacinta, there was a discussion of SAM, the South Australian Museum, and many museums are just doing this work now, and it's unfair to say the museums are doing this work. People who work within them are leading this. And it's not, we're maybe not there yet, but there are a lot of opportunities to be able to engage. Their work, again, takes on the difficult relationship that places like the Australian Museum have, because they collected and continue to have held in their collection items that are contested in terms of who owns them, who has the right to tell the story of them, and whose uh, relationship to them should be, how that should be framed. So there's still a lot of, they would say, and part of what Waranara Tours does is says, actually, yes, it's got the collector's name up here, and then it doesn't have the Aboriginal person who made its name up here, but it's being swapped out with a different way of thinking about this. Maker unknown, maker not known now, but also other more agentic language, right? Um, Again, what we're seeing now, I wish I could show you the website from 20 years ago or 15 years ago, because it's quite different. We're seeing things that don't look, this is again the Australian Museum website. We're seeing things that do not look like a museum space. We're seeing these challenges. Actually, the one that is on the megafauna, which is actually an exhibition that I worked on about 35 years ago, is has this gorgeous retelling again by Jacinta Kamatri, and and a lot of really clear ideas of how to understand what's otherwise been presented as a very straightforward natural history unfolding. So there's also some insistences here, and I wanted to include the why we need to collect predator poo, mostly for the next line, which is mob at the museum, cultural resident. The notion of saying mob at the museum is again the kind of insider language that you just simply weren't getting 15 years ago, 10 years ago. And the changes there, again, are insistences. The notion of events that bring in material from outside and contextualize it in the space is incredibly important. So knowing that these are spaces that people are welcome in is, again, a really important point. So monumental disruptions I wanted to mention, again, around not just 2020, it certainly started before and has continued on since, is the resistances to colonial monuments, and those resistances have included that's Tony Albert, who we'll revisit right at the end of this. It's also really understanding, not just about the tearing down, though absolutely. It's also about understanding the context of how these continue to exist in these spaces, how we have these figures of, in a lot of cases, not just um, architects of the colonial project, but murderers that are framed in a way that you would not see if the people they were murdering were not Indigenous people. It's sort of as simple as that. And Monumental Disruptions is a great book. I really strongly recommend that you read it. It covers the ground of thinking about, again, who has the right to tell the story and how that story can be reclaimed, because this is the space outside of the museum, right? This is the space that is often not held up to ICIP principles, which, by the way, exist in institutions. So institutions are increasingly either required or are volunteering. There's kind of some complexity around that I'll let you read around. Um, they frame a sense of responsibility to Indigenous people. And what's interesting is that many of these, particularly in so-called Australia, many of these statues are connected to local councils. So they have the brief of control over these spaces. And so local councils are varying in terms of their relationship with ICIP. And some places are very progressive, won't surprise you to hear, some places less so. And there is, in line with everything that you've done this semester, there's a really difficult relationship to the what's happening right now in terms of resistances, not from First Nations people, but against First Nations people. And that has made this somewhat of a difficult shape, so that Thief Pakeha becomes unwarranted graffiti rather than, Indigenous commentary. Um, and of course, even in the colonial state, here's Bristol, we see the tearing down, in this case it's a Cecil Rhodes statue. And of course, I say this as someone who, is connected to Wallumattagal campus, which is obviously Wallumattagal always will be, but on Macquarie University, deeply concerning colonial murderer. So the work that I've been doing, and I've just whacked up a piece here by me and Associate Professor Maddie Day, is on this idea of gender. And you heard it a little bit in Jacinta's work of saying, what do we know? How can we reveal? But also saying this is very much about the idea of greater complexity. When historically we saw Indigenous people represented, it was very, very rare for us to be represented as complex within museum spaces. Um, Not just in terms of gender, so I write about gender, but I also write about everything else in terms of these containers that the colonial project puts Indigenous people in when they go into museums. That's not what happens when we're doing this work. And so part of it is understanding what's in it for people who are engaged in that space. So, the way to do anti-colonial work in a museum, and again, the decolonisation of museums. Some museums can be decolonised, but not a non-Indigenous museum. A non-Indigenous museum can have anti-colonial work that happens in there, but just like universities and other institutions that are not controlled by Indigenous people, the decolonisation is only exists in isolation, and that can't be a decolonisation. But what's interesting about anti-colonial work is that we can all do it. One would argue that only Indigenous people can really have a hand in decolonising spaces, but anti-colonial work is something that we can all do. And there is a massive amount of agency in that, and it's disruptions. It's disruptions, and disruptions not just in service of bringing something down, but in service of what exists there when it is brought down. So when a statue is brought down, the space still exists. And not just the space of where that is, but the context of who's in that space exists. And so it's the same here. So the work I do is often on the way that stories are told. So Jacinta's video, but really life's work, has been on this idea that we have to have a hand in the stories that we're telling, that they become incredibly important in um, understanding who people are, but also knowing what we can't know. You know, not trying to break everything open to say, come on in and find out everything about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people or First Nations people around the world. It's also saying sometimes you don't have a right to know. Sometimes none of us can know. We don't have to guess at things. We don't have to, frame it as a magical understanding of the past. And we're not seeing that. We were seeing those romanticized stories of our communities historically, and now what we're seeing is our own renderings from memory, from story, from long held ideas, from the kinds of stories that were framed as myth. And again, there's a really gorgeous piece that you would have seen on that I mentioned on the Australian Museum site that's again put together by Jacinta Kilmartry that does this great work of saying, don't just think of things as myths, understand how myths work. And this is indeed the kind of idea that I've engaged as I look at the way that gender is framed historically by curators. And so I'm interested in that space. Sorry, I'll go back to the last slide. I'm interested in that space because guesswork is done. Nobody believes that a curator is guessing at things, ever. But that's really how gender works when you're going back 10,000 years or 20,000 years. People are just guessing. So I've often made the sounds like a joke, don't mean it as a joke, but people will say, can you prove that there were transgender people, trans people in the past, in the deep past? And my response to that is I no, and I can't prove that there were cisgender people in the past either. This is part of it is we don't know the past. We retell from our own perspectives. And we have to understand that in retelling, we're trying to make story meaningful for visitors in the context of museums, but also in the work that we do as researchers. But we must think about the fact that we're sometimes getting it wrong. And so the who curates really matters for this. Who is telling that story and who is reading the story of our bodies and why do they think that's okay to do that? So who controls the narrative becomes central to this. Again, the whole can we all decolonize? I can say that I'm going to decolonize at my section of a university. It doesn't make the rest of the space decolonized because it is still essentially the colonial project. And museums in particular were absolutely the colonial project of collecting, of bringing in from colonial worlds, in their rendering and making sense of them for a story to be told. And so the disruption that I see is telling a really complex story. And so I went to the Creation Museum as a part of my project that I did some years ago. This is a piece from like maybe 15 years ago, this image. And Creation Museums in Kentucky, it's about creationism. It's very much, has children and dinosaurs dangerously close together. But, it retells a story that suggests creationism is truth and science is incorrect. It also has some very liminal racism throughout it. But it does some interesting political work. And I wanted to mention it here because this political work is really essential to understanding how we continue to um, be subject to how curators are telling a story and why they're telling the story. So this is a doctrine of marriage document that comes up in the Creation Museum at the same time that politically they're trying to get marriage equality through. So it doesn't it's not there from the beginning of the development of the Creation Museum. It's there as a political act. Similarly, as there starts to be discussions around trans, both trans and non-binary or trans non-binary people, there starts to be this, oh, no, 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 here we go, it's this. So it starts to respond to something that's happening politically rather than something that's necessarily a part of their story. And this is true generally. And of course, it can be true for us too. So one of the things that I do with my work is that I reverse the gaze. So instead of GAZE, so instead of just looking at what we're doing, I look at European spaces. So I'll often look at something like the Willendorf figurine or Lion Man. And when I look at these, I will, read around some work that's been done on this. And so we have, with the Willendorf figurine, this notion of it being a pregnant body, but also it's always framed as a woman. And there's absolutely no evidence for that. Again, I would say Willendorf figurine looks a bit like me, and I'm not a woman. So here we go. So these are some renderings, but also we know things after the fact that weren't known at earlier times. And so Willendorf figurine is 30,000 years ago, right? So it's what's called an Ice Age art object from Europe. It is a figure that originally was framed as a pregnant body because of the shape. Now, again, I could say that's my shape. I'm not pregnant. If I didn't mention it before, I'm 60. So this is now we know a perspective work. So two things are happening when it's not seen as a perspective work. So in other words, it's a work that's created by looking down on one's body. So the first thing is that the assumption is that it couldn't have been the person it couldn't have been a self-portrait. And that's the gendering, binary gendering, of how making was framed historically, right? It's really interesting in that way. But the other thing is that it um, distorts the shape when you're looking down on a body. And so that distortion is, again, now understood. Things like Lion Man with the extension of the pubis, or is it a penis? And so these kinds of notions are really misunderstood. And yeah, it's extremely interesting to see how that becomes framed. Um, so in this, notion of ICIP is this idea of who controls spaces. And it's very much there or its development was as a protection for Indigenous people against institutions. What we see, and I'll finish with this, I promise, is that we see with works like Tony Albert's current, who's an amazing artist, Aboriginal artist, work is called Not a Souvenir. It's up at the moment, 21st of May. As I record this, it is 21st of May through to 19th of October at the MCA at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney. And it's retrospective of a mid-career retrospective of Tony's or of Albert's work. And Albert as an artist has a remarkable body of work. It includes a collection of Aboriginalia, which is this incredibly problematic work that was produced from the 19th century through, well, some earlier as well, through to very much the 20th century. And it includes, romanticized notions, racist figures, um, really problematic contexts. There's a piece within this that's called Ashamed, which is about the faces of and bodies of Aboriginal people as ashtrays, where the cigarette is being ashed out on the faces of Aboriginal people. Really remarkable work. But it's calling out the kind of whimsy around this too, even a nostalgia around it, at the same time as how deeply problematic this is. It's doing all of that work and it's doing it in a really complex way. It's called Not a Souvenir, and it's there, if you don't know, MCA's down at the Rocks. And so it's there in this space that you walk outside and it's like everything is a souvenir. And then in the background of these two really powerful works, actually three, it's missing one, is the Carnival cruise ship. So you're seeing this remarkable sight and the juxtapositions of the Aboriginal body that has always belonged there. And so there is this complexity to the way that that Tony Albert frames this work. I mean, absolutely gorgeous. Can't recommend it enough. It's amazing work. Um, and the complexity is around who was buying it, who was collecting it, when people were getting rid of it, the relationship that Tony Albert has to the work, the idea, as he frames, that this was something that connected him to other Aboriginal people as a kid, seeing this in op shops, right? And people like me, my dad who's an Aboriginal man, used to make this. So there were many of us that actually made this in the 60s and 70s as well. And knowing that they were kind of racist figures, but it was, again, being a part of that structure of saying, if other people are making money off this, at least it's made by blackfella. So there's this kind of agency to that as well. And this complexity is there and held, calling it out is there and held, but also calling it out with affection and anger at the same time is held. And it's one of the more powerful elements to this kind of work, but it's also there in the who tells the story. Um, there's a challenge room. So there's a room where a colonial artist who included Aboriginal items across their artworks there's a conversation, as Tony Albert frames it, with that artist who's no longer alive. It's a conversation with the work, where it's reincorporating into something that is Indigenous made. And so there is a power in that. They're the things that I think are really important to think about in the way that we consider the anti-colonial work. The idea of not just taking back spaces because, they were never our spaces. These were always colonial institutions. It's about calling out the issues within spaces through something like ICIP, but also through protest and action. And also doing this resistance work to reframing as the work that we want to replace it with. And the work is more popular than ever. It's more interesting to international visitors. It stops the circular narrative of, oh, we were never told, or of, oh, Aboriginal lives are just really sad. Or, it stops all of that from being the only narratives that can be there and starts to be the narratives that we need, as complex as they are. Thanks for being a part of this. I will end on that, but I'd really strongly recommend you go and look at some of these links, go and see some of this work if you can. It's just incredibly powerful. Thanks.